right? Thanking and praising God once again for the ways in which he can increase our understanding or recognition of things that are sometimes right in front of our face, even if they are still difficult to see. Let's call Mark chapter 9. Cross and crown, recognition to understand that we have talked about that concept of recognition before in context of the demons who seemed to recognize more about the Christ than the people around him who were trying to follow him, whose reality in some ways was apparent to them even though they couldn't see it. Likewise, as we mentioned in life, we can be in that same circumstance. And now that we have seen Peter recognize him as the Christ, we've also seen Peter stumble immediately after that great recognition, reminding us that his disciples, apostles, those following him still had more to do in spite of their best intentions. And in this chapter, I think he is going to take another step forward to helping them understand the responsibility that goes along with the privilege of being the Christ. And as we said in the last chapter, setting an example for them to understand the responsibility that goes on with that goes along with the privilege of being an apostle, which likewise sets the example for us as his followers. There is a privilege that sometimes can seem remote because we are so often mired in the struggle of life, but there is a privilege that goes along with being his. And this chapter in some ways reminds us that as soon as the struggles of life are lifted away from us, we can become so inflated with the blessings of life that we begin to think too much of the good things that God has done for us in this chapter, where the apostles, as we discussed a little bit in our Wednesday night class, were unable to heal a demon coming down from the Mount of Transfiguration. They told Jesus, and he, in Matthew's version, lamented the connection between their lack of faith and their inability to cast out the demon. But Mark's version is going to be similar to Matthew's version in the sense that there doesn't seem to be very much time that passes by in that failure before they begin to argue which of them is the greatest, when if they could have kept that failure in mind, as we discussed, who's the greatest seems to be a moot point, understanding all of the things that they still struggle to do. And so in life, it's a similar situation for us. When we're bogged down in the struggles, when we are bogged down in the struggles, it can seem overwhelming. But one of the reasons why too often, as little as I like to continue to struggle, one of the reasons why it's necessary is far too often after the struggle is gone, I can be tempted to ponder things that are irrelevant, focused more on the privileges and the comforts that I have in life. And so in this chapter, it is going to begin in verses 1 through 13, talking about the transfiguration. And in spite of Peter's failure in the last chapter, God or Jesus is going to take Peter, James, and John up to the Mount of Transfiguration with him, where he will be seen with Elijah and Moses, puzzling Peter as to what to say. He is going to offer to build a shelter for all three. God is going to seem to cut him off to say, look, the point is, listen to his son. Going down from the Mount of Transfiguration, he is going to tell them, do not say anything until, verse 9, the Son of Man has risen from the dead, a question they still do not seem to understand, or a point they still don't seem to understand, questioning the meaning of it. He is going to go on and answer their questions, as we saw in Matthew, about, wait a minute, isn't Elijah supposed to come first? As he is going to say, Elijah has already come first. Matthew making it clear that they understood he meant John the Baptist, but the common denominator between he and John the Baptist is going to be that whoever they are to God is not going to keep the people from treating them however they so chose. And as they, seeming to allude to the fact that as they killed John or did whatever they pleased with John, that is likewise going to emphasize the point that he is trying to emphasize to his apostles. They're likewise going to treat the Christ the same way. Understanding that verses 14 through 29 are going to tell the story in the similar organization or order that Matthew told it, of the Spirit disabling a man's son, a spirit that the apostles could not cast out. Christ indeed cast out the spirit that seems to have been plaguing this boy since childhood, at least as far as his father says it, with the interesting thing in the man's humility. He seems to say, if you can do anything, we would appreciate it. That's my paraphrase. But Christ is going to point his attention to the if. It's not if he can do anything. It's if the man believes, the man being candid, saying, I believe, but help my unbelief, seeming to be a contradictory statement. But the fact that he came to Christ in the first place means that he believes to a degree, but he may be acknowledging that the level of faith he has is not enough. Therefore, he's humbling himself before the Christ to prioritize his child and saying, instead of me trying to be proud and saying, look, I came to you in the first place, please help me bridge the gap between the faith I've got and the faith I need. Oh, mercy. With that, it's a clear teaching point there, but after Christ indeed drives out the disabling spirit and explains to the apostles why they couldn't drive it out in verse 29. This time in Mark's description, it's going to seem to be a little bit more gentle when he tells them this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. He's then going to go on to foretell his death and resurrection again in verses 30 through 32, as he's then going to question them. What they were arguing about or discussing on the way in verse 33, at which point they're going to seem to be ashamed and keep silent, as he's going to seem to already realize that they were arguing about who was the greatest, verse 34, as he is going to give them once again a reminder that if anyone would be first, he must be last and servant of all. And then he's going to use the famous illustration in verse 36 of a child, this time seeming to illustrate. It's not going to say in the verse or in the chapter, but in the larger context, understanding that in this culture, children ranked least. And so receiving one who has relatively low or no status has a lot to do with the way in which they will actually receive the kingdom in a way that's pleasing to God. Understanding that Matthew literally makes the point, unless they receive the kingdom as a little child, they won't even get in. As we talked about in Matthew's description of this story, they don't need to worry about who's first. They might not even have the mindset to get in at all. And so the whole concept of being first is irrelevant here. Mark seems to take a little bit of a different perspective, meaning that as he is recently taught, they need to be able to receive the least in the society with the same attitude they would extend to those who are perceived as being the greatest. Chapter going on in verses 38 through 41 to tell the story of one who is doing mighty works, or at least doing works in Christ's name. One who, I think it is John, said we tried to stop him, but kind of leaves it off in terms of doubt as to whether or not they were able, making it seem like they weren't. It's not going to matter because Jesus is going to say, don't stop him, because anyone who is genuinely, I'm adding the word genuinely, doing works in his name cannot then become like the Pharisees, the scribes, let's see later, the chief priests, etc., who are causing them all kinds of problems. And so he is saying the ones who are helping them, even if you don't know them, if they're genuinely helping them, leave them alone. Let them go, because then he is going to give us the contrast that's similar to what we saw in his illustration from receiving the kingdom as a child. In Matthew, he's going to go on to talk about the need to avoid becoming a stumbling block to God's work. And so it seems to set up a contrast in verses 38 through 41, recognizing those who are a genuine help and not considering them enemies, even if you don't know them all that well, as opposed to distinguishing them from those who are a hindrance, understanding the need to not only be wary of the external hindrances to us, but warning us about the need to not be a hindrance to those who are legitimately doing God's work, and not only to avoid the temptation to be a hindrance to others, but to consider seriously anything, whether it's a hand, a foot, or an eye, that would cause us internally to be a hindrance to ourselves. Understanding that one of the greatest hindrances to ourselves can be our sense of self. The sequence in this chapter caught my attention once I looked at the healing of the boy with the disabling spirit as quite possibly a pause between the transfiguration and the teaching point that he makes in foretelling his death a second time. Understanding that after he comes down from the Mount of Transfiguration, after having been recognized by his Father's voice, not only with the appearance of being transfigured, but his Father saying, listen to his Son. He humbles himself, first of all, not using it as an opportunity to get status by having the three who went with him just go and tell it. He tells them, first of all, to be quiet. And then after they are interrupted by the need to heal the child, he then goes on and gives them the warning that once again, he's not going to be here for very much longer. Understanding that his privilege comes along with the responsibility of, as we said, the cross that comes before the crown. The reason why that's so important is they still need to learn that lesson for themselves, as the very next thing that happens is him having to deal with the conversation that they're having about who's the greatest. If they really were putting two and two together, as we said before, the fact that they could not heal the boy with the disabling spirit should have been a great reason for humility. But in life, if, as we mentioned before, I put too much distance between my struggles and my now, especially when my now is going pretty well, then I'll forget all the reasons life has given me to be humble, and I will get my priorities all twisted. And so what we seem to have here is a situation where Jesus is leading by example, having been transfigured and getting a recommendation. Like in life, you might get a recommendation for a job. He's getting a recommendation from God himself, but he's not letting it go to his head. Reminding me of something I saw not too long ago in an interview with head coach Mike Tomlin, head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers, when one of his former players and two of his buddies brought him on a podcast called The Pivot, wanting to do something that so rarely happens in life, what people call giving folks their flowers now while he's yet still coaching, giving him credit for all of the success that he's had over the years, something that coach seemed to be really uncomfortable with. And as they realized that, going through the interview, how he deflected just about every compliment they gave him, they kind of got to the point of asking him, why is that? Why is he so uncomfortable taking the praise? And I'm going to butcher his phrasing of it, but he basically said, all those compliments aren't helping me accomplish the goals I still have left in life. Reminding me of what I see here in Mark chapter 9, realizing that while the transfiguration is something that helps us understand that the recognition in life is important because there is a reward for all of the struggle. The bottom line is, as long as we have more to do, staying focused on the responsibilities that go along with our success has everything to do with helping us to overcome the obstacles to either maintaining our success or finally achieving the success we crave.